All right, welcome to the Cambridge Disaster Research Network, or CDRN. For those of you who haven't joined us before, CDRN is a network for those interested in disasters and natural hazards from departments both across the University of Cambridge and beyond. Our objective is to connect hazard and disaster research and researchers across disciplines and to link academic approaches to the needs and experiences of practitioners. I'm Ellen Kuyava, and I'm a PhD student in the Department of Geography here at the University of Cambridge. And we're excited to welcome you to our last CDRN session of the term, Reimagining Risk. Do we need a new narrative on adaptation to climate change? Today, we'll be hearing from Katy Harris and Zoha Shawoo, both of whom are from Stockholm Environmental Institute. Katy Harris is a senior policy fellow at SEI headquarters with a focus on global governance of climate change adaptation. She is also the director of Adaptation Without Borders. Her work focuses on transboundary climate risk, multilateral cooperation on adaptation, and governance frameworks and policy. Zoha Shawoo is a scientist at SEI working in the Equitable Transitions Program. Her research focuses on the intersection between climate change, inequality, and sustainable development. And we're just so excited to have them both here with us today. We'll run the session a little bit differently than we usually do, with a little bit more audience interaction. Katy and Zoha will each present some slides and then have a short conversation reflecting on each other's interventions and what they mean for adaptation policy and practice. And then we'll open it up to questions and feedback from the audience. And we're looking forward to a lively discussion. Katy, would you like to begin?
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Ellen. Hi, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here today. Zoha and I are really looking forward to our conversations over the next hour. So I'm going to start off with presenting just a few slides on my area of work, which is on transboundary climate risks. 3 words that I say more than I ever thought I'd repeat a phrase in my life. That's basically the whole focus of my work at SEI. And then Zoha's going to present a bit on locally led adaptation and her amazing work advancing sort of local communities and local people's rights to lead their adaptation and get compensated for the losses and damages they're experiencing. And then we're going to have a chat about how do you combine these approaches and what some of the challenges, what are some of the opportunities. And this is all a super new area of work. So we thought this was a great opportunity for us. I'm based in Sweden, Zoha's over in the US, to have a conversation between us, one that we don't get to have very often, but then also to join in with all of you. So really keen to hear your questions, your reflections, your thoughts on these topics that we're going to raise. Okay, but first of all, maybe I'll give you a little bit of a 101 on what are transboundary climate risks. Can you see my slide deck? Great. Okay, so transboundary climate risks. First of all, to say there is a lot of different names for these risks. Sometimes they're called international climate risks. That's often what the UK government refer to them as. Sometimes they're called cascading climate risks, which is often is becoming increasingly used to refer to these sorts of risks because transboundary can often denote very political consequences. The UN use the term transboundary climate risks. So that's the one I'm going to use here today. And essentially what we mean, or sort of what these risks or how they manifest and come about, are when the impacts of climate change in one country or jurisdiction generate a threat, a risk to the economy, society, or ecosystems of another. Sometimes we mainly use them to talk about when climate change impacts sort of ripple out across national borders. So essentially you have a climate change impact in one country and it creates a risk to another country. But often they're being used also to refer to those same dynamics within a country's borders. So when it crosses jurisdictions or states within a country, particularly where adaptation is sort of governed within sort of local administrations, you can also get these transboundary effects. So that's what transboundary climate risks are. They also manifest, or we also explore, when mitigation or adaptation actions in one place generate adverse effects in another. We quite often think of adaptation as being an inherently good thing, builds resilience, it's beneficial, but actually what can build the resilience of one group can sometimes undermine that of another group, and you end up with vulnerability being redistributed between different groups rather than reduced outright. So we often think about transboundary risks, and we have a long history of transboundary risks being explored and analysed and understood when they cross neighbouring countries, particularly shared river basins. For instance, we have a lot of transboundary river commissions and agreements set up to manage risks that flow between two countries when it comes to two neighbouring countries when it comes to a river basin. But we particularly focus, like the work that I do in the team and the partnership that I coordinate, we particularly focus on those risks that connect remote countries. So sometimes these are called teleconnected risks, but they're essentially where the impacts of climate change in one context generate a risk for a country on the other side of the world in some cases, or they cascade through multiple countries and regions in ways not dissimilar to that, which we've seen recently with the COVID-19 pandemic. The quote on the screen that you can see there is from the IPCC AR6. It was really the first assessment cycle to recognise that transboundary climate risks exist. And it does it throughout the Working Group 2 report and the summaries for policymakers. This is just one quote. So it finds with high confidence that weather and climate extremes are causing economic and societal impacts across national boundaries through supply chains, markets, and natural resource flows, with increasing transboundary risks projected across the water, energy, and food sectors. So that gave you a bit of an idea of some of the sectors, some of the systems that these risks affect. But to give you some other examples, they mainly manifest when risks propagate through dependencies, through interconnections between countries, through the relationships that countries have with one another. So I've already mentioned about shared river basin. So they can be transmitted through shared biophysical systems. This is one way. So when climate change or adaptation actions disrupt the flow of transboundary rivers or aquifers, as I've just mentioned, but also not just traveling through water, they can also travel through air. So where climate change in one place might exacerbate air pollution for another context, or other kinds of shared ecosystems and natural resources. They can also be transmitted through changing flows of people. And when we tend to think about sort of human mobility and transboundary climate risks, we tend to talk not so much that the changing flows of people is the risk in itself. The risk is that those flows are poorly managed. So those risks sort of arise when climate change or adaptation actions change patterns of human mobility. That might be migration, displacement, also tourism, and that is poorly managed. And then a few other groups. So through trade and supply chains or financial investments. So these are sort of a group of risks that we've really focused on within SEI, and they can manifest when climate change or adaptation actions damage shared infrastructure on which many countries depend, a shared port, for instance, or a canal. When climate change reduces or alters the production or the distribution of food around the world, other goods and services, critical raw materials that are increasingly necessary for the green transition, essentially disrupt a country's imports that they're very reliant on for for human security and development, or when climate change can alter remittances or other forms of financial flows, and so reduce the financial flows that are entering a country. So left unchecked, these sorts of risks, transboundary, cascading climate risks, can really impede progress towards many of the Sustainable Development Goals, increasing food and water insecurity, disrupting trade or energy supplies, threatening jobs and livelihoods, and undermining people's social and economic development. They're really important because we don't tend to, when I say we, I mean those that are tasked with running climate risk and vulnerability assessments and producing national adaptation plans, we don't tend to think of risk in this way. So most climate risk and vulnerability assessments will only look at the direct impacts of climate change that a country is projected to experience. They won't be thinking about how that country is vulnerable to climate change because of these impacts of climate change all around the world that make that country particularly at risk in different ways. And very few national adaptation plans, although that's starting to change, and I'm happy to talk more about that later, really sort of come up with strong adaptation actions that build resilience to these sorts of risks. We've really only scratched the surface in terms of thinking about what even does adaptation look like to big international, transboundary, complex cascading risks. So that's what we try and shed light on within SEI and the broader partnership in which I work. So just a little bit, I wanted to say a little bit, because the focus of this webinar is really on debating, do we need a new narrative on adaptation to climate change? Can locally led adaptation effectively manage these sorts of risks? So I just wanted to give you a bit of a flavour of what research has been done on this particular question. So there is a fairly recent journal article that's come out called Think Global, Act Local, the challenge of producing actionable knowledge on transboundary climate risk at the subnational level of governance. So this article drew on a project called Unchain and explored the management of transboundary climate risks at the subnational level, looked at case studies on how local actors tried to adapt to transboundary climate risks in Norway, France, and Germany. And it really tried to articulate some of the problems and prospects for subnational authorities in addressing these risks. It's a classic research paper in that it concludes with an open question, that it remains an open question whether local authorities can and should play an equally central role in addressing transboundary climate risks as they do in the case of local or direct climate risks. That's the question that we're going to be discussing here today. And the authors of that article advocate for therefore for a really strong partnership between different levels of governance. So all the way from local authorities up to national governments, up to regional organisations, up to global and international organisations, to really come together to collaborate on adaptation actions to manage these risks and to really involve the strong collaboration between the public and private sectors in doing so, particularly for those risks to supply chains and so on, and to global trade. So I just last week was talking to some local adaptation planners involved in local provinces in China, and we were discussing how you might begin to, if you're a local adaptation planner, how do you start accounting for transboundary climate risks? Some of the ideas that we were discussing together was that you might, rather than starting from the hazard, which you normally do in risk assessment approaches, you start with a risk. So start to look at how your community and then your broader country might be dependent on other parts of the world, other areas that and where those flows or those places might be particularly sensitive to the impacts of climate change. We think you probably need to deploy a lot of sort of expert judgment in these cases. So really talk to a whole range of different stakeholders and actors, and rely much more on qualitative methods rather than quantitative methods to identify what might be some of the impact chains that you might see, or how climate change creates these ripple effects through regional and global systems. And that it's really important to complement any technical risk assessment with a sort of concern assessment, and I'll come on to this in a minute, but where you really capture stakeholders' different views and interests with regard to the risk, and debate who should be responsible for managing and owning these risks, which is much less clear than in the case of local climate risks. Nearly at the end before I hand over to Zoha. So then we talk a bit more about this in a couple of other journal articles that I just wanted to flag to you all. So the first is an article that I led on, but with others a few years ago, and it's called Rising to a New Challenge, a protocol for case study research on transboundary climate risk. And it's mainly aimed at researchers looking to produce case studies on these sorts of risks, but it's also being increasingly used policymakers who are sort of undertaking some of the steps that you can see on the left-hand side there, to incorporate transboundary climate risks into climate risk assessments and international adaptation plans. And then, yeah, we've also summarized some of the key findings of not only incorporating transboundary climate risks, but other sort of innovations in climate risk assessment in this editorial, which is called New Approaches to Local Climate Change Risk Assessment. So Adaptation Without Borders is a partnership. It's got 13 organizations within the partnership now. It was founded by ODI, SCI and IDRI, so 3 think tanks, but we now work across all different continents of the world, and we're working specifically to try to better understand transboundary climate risks and to strengthen international cooperation on adaptation to better manage them in the future. So we've been working so far in the last sort of 5 years since its inception, mainly at the international level. So I'm here at the UNFCCC right now, looking at how transboundary climate risks should appear and feature in the new guidelines that are being produced for national adaptation plans with least developed countries. We got some decision text at COP28 on transboundary climate risks for the first time. We've been trying to work out how they could be included within the global stocktake that happens and the global goal on adaptation at the UN level. So we've been doing a lot of work at that level, and then we've also been doing a lot of work at the regional level, so with the African Union and the African Union's regional economic communities to think about what role could regional organisations play in managing these risks. And we've been doing a lot of work at the national level. So we've just done a transboundary climate risk assessment for Ireland, for instance. We're increasingly working with lower income countries to support their efforts to incorporate transboundary climate risks in their national risk assessments. But I would say what we haven't done so far yet is try and link some of this work to the amazing work that's going on across SEI and beyond on locally led adaptation approaches. And this is why I'm really excited to have this discussion here today and think, how can we do that better? So I will leave it there, maybe hold your questions and comments, but scribble them down because really excited to take them. And I'll turn to Zoha now to share a bit about the work we're doing at the local level.
Thank you. I hope you can see my screen okay. And thanks, Katie, for setting that up really nicely. Yeah, so I'll talk a little bit about work on locally led approaches to adaptation and loss and damage, which is kind of my personal area of expertise. And so I'll try to kind of link and draw linkages from that area of work as well. And I really wanted to start with an example of the impacts of climate change that are felt at the local level. And this is work that we did together with a local partner in Nepal, assessing the impacts of climate change following some large-scale flooding in 2022. And you can see these pictures that I took from the field, which were taken a year after the flooding. And so you can see the extent to which the damage is still there, where people's entire homes and houses have been destroyed and collapsed. You've seen bridges that have been collapsed, which means that communities are very much isolated from the towns and cities, and so aren't able to necessarily move and sell their crops and products, and their economic activities are impacted. All of these areas where you see a lot of these rocks, this used to be farmland. And so that essentially means that all of this farmland has been lost and not, repaired or compensated. And so we kind of tried to quantify the estimated cost of the losses and damages, and found that it was around 52,000 per household in terms of the damages that they faced. But compensation that they received was only around 380 on average, which means that, these activities have not been compensated. And then there's also the opportunity cost that has not been accounted for in this case. So the cost of not being able to contribute to economic activities as in the past. We also see a lot of non-economic losses and damages. So for example, trauma and anxiety, a lot of 85.8% of people mentioned having suffered from mental stress as a result of these impacts. And what I really wanted to show through this is that the impacts of climate change are very local and are very localized in this case, and could be localized even if these risks emerge from transboundary implications. And so it's important to think about how adaptation interventions can be designed to support these communities that are highly vulnerable and at risk, and to account for their needs and priorities in designing adaptation solutions. We also very recently did some work on nature-based solutions for adaptation. So looking at things like climate smart agriculture or ecosystem-based adaptation. And here again, what we find is that a lot of the challenges with managing risk are local and are structural, right? So it has to do with, for example, issues related to land rights and tenure, which mean that certain adaptation solutions can exclude groups from, or can grab land away from groups that depend on it, particularly marginalized groups, or in contexts where land rights are very informal and not formalized. So in those cases, and we see this in Tanzania in particular, where like REDD+ is expected to generate a lot of benefits for communities for both mitigation and adaptation, but is often leading to the exclusion of these communities from their lands. You also have kind of challenges with knowledge and capacity at the local level when adaptation solutions are implemented. And so there's a need for investing in like the capacity of institutions and building up governance systems. We also find that in cases where participatory and community-based design has been used to implement adaptation, these have been more effective in kind of directly responding to community priorities and needs. We've seen kind of the importance of alternative livelihoods provision. So for example, making sure that communities have access to non-timber forest products that they can sell for economic benefits is kind of particularly important, making sure that they benefit from these interventions, which may affect their alternative sources of income. We found that local governance systems, so things like village councils being involved, makes buy-in into adaptation solutions much better, and kind of, just involves the community, because these are kind of trusted actors in the space, and kind of makes sure that you're kind of ingraining adaptation solutions within local governance systems. And we also find that engaging with local partners and NGOs who, again, are trusted within the communities and are aware of the power dynamics and landscape within which we are operating, also makes adaptation solutions more effective. So that's kind of showing some of the factors that affect the effectiveness of locally led adaptation approaches. So keeping all of that in mind, we developed this framework, and I will not go into too much detail on this because I realize it's quite dense, but it's basically a framework for funders and implementers of adaptation finance to think about how they can advance equity or distributive equity here in particular, which refers to the fair distribution of costs and benefits. This is really drawing on literature on maladaptation, which basically says that adaptation is likely to exacerbate risks if you're not taking into account the root causes of vulnerability. And by the root causes of vulnerability, here we mean things like access to resources, unequal power dynamics, and so on. And so what we're really arguing here is that if you just want to achieve equitable outputs, then you could invest in, making sure that money reaches the right people on the ground, reaches vulnerable groups, and that it enhances access to resources, which again is very critical. So access to water, energy, food, health, education is very critical for reducing vulnerability to begin with. But beyond that, if you want to achieve equitable outcomes in adaptation, and going beyond that even further, if you want to achieve structural change, that you can't necessarily stop there. You have to invest in, for example, protecting the human rights of populations. You have to invest in ensuring social protection and making sure that basic needs of communities are being met, to protect livelihoods, reduce poverty, ensure a decent standard of living. Investing in enhancing capabilities and opportunities, so making sure that communities are able to pursue and achieve what they value and have the freedom to do so. Addressing intersectionality, so accounting for the different ways in which marginalized groups are vulnerable and how how race, gender, ethnicity, religion, and other factors would interact to influence vulnerability. Addressing unequal power dynamics and enabling decolonization, so kind of transforming existing power relations that affect things like why people don't have access to land to begin with, or why people don't have access to resources to begin with, and why they are vulnerable in society. So, and correcting historical wrongs that are resulting from colonial legacies. And so the point I'm trying to make is that adaptation solutions are not often as simple as something like building a seawall or a dam to enhance, a water security or something like that. It often is much broader than that and much more expansive definition that looks into addressing these root causes of vulnerability to make sure that people are not vulnerable to begin with. And that, we argue, is very much something that needs to be done at the local level alongside communities to identify what their needs and priorities are, the different ways in which they're vulnerable, what are the kind of, different forms of marginalization they're experiencing to tackle those factors as well. Now I just wanted to give an example of a financial mechanism that does operate at the local level, which is small grants. So small grants can be provided directly to local NGOs or communities, which is kind of a contrast from large-scale adaptation finance, which is often goes directly to the national government, is often left to their it's dependent on their priorities, how it is used, and according to kind of national plans and policies, which is different from a participatory approach of engaging with communities to determine how best the money should be used. And so here, looking at the Scottish government's small grants that they provided in 3 or 4 different countries for loss and damage, but they very much left it to the communities to define the activities they wanted to use the funding for, so what loss and damage actually is. And in this case, it actually highly overlapped with adaptation. And we tried to assess the successes and limitations of this type of instrument and this type of locally led approach in supporting communities, and basically found that it is very effective in kind of prioritizing some of those dimensions that I was mentioning around protecting human rights and prioritizing self-determination and making sure that adaptation actions are responding to community priorities. The grants in particular had a community-led process of consultations to actually decide how the money would be used according to local priorities. And so it's very good in this kind of co-productive design approach because you don't have a predetermined projects that communities have to implement. And it is particularly useful for addressing underlying factors of vulnerability because it's kind of directly supporting marginalized communities in the way that the small grants were designed were to make sure that, for example, women-headed households were able to kind of benefit from the intervention and things like that. But there are also kind of some challenges and limitations. So for example, a lot of the projects focused on kind of supporting with migration and relocation support, which could be classified as adaptation or loss and damage. The boundaries are kind of blurred, but it is interesting because this type of kind of locally led approach was particularly useful for identifying, for example, whether communities wanted to stay or wanted to move, and kind of designing adaptation interventions accordingly. So for example, they refer to, trapped populations who are not able to move or are unable to move, and that adaptation intervention would be very different from communities that have decided to move already. So it's kind of providing the necessary resources to support communities' livelihoods and access to resources, either whether they move or if they do not move. And the challenge that came about when they were moving was that access to land is very difficult. And so in that case, you often do need larger scale national level approaches to kind of acquire land to enable communities to move as well. But in many cases, communities would choose not to relocate because they have kind of cultural ties to the land that they're in. A lot of their ancestors were lived there and buried there. And so even in this case, it's important to make sure that adaptation interventions and loss and damage interventions are designed to account for those types of factors as well. But ultimately, a lot of our findings suggested that locally led approaches in and of themselves are probably not sufficient to address the full spectrum of adaptation risks and need to be paired with larger scale national level measures that have to do with infrastructure building and things like that. And so it's kind of there's a need to explore how these two different approaches go hand in hand with each other, and that even when you have larger scale national adaptation interventions being implemented, how do they also account for local priorities? How do they also have a participatory approach to designing these adaptation interventions, even if they end up not being locally led, right? So how do you actually make sure those voices are being included in how those projects are being designed? So I will stop there. Hope that was interesting and looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Zoha. And maybe before we turn to Ellen to chair the discussion, we've got a couple of questions that we wanted to ask each other. So bear with us. But please do then raise your hand if you want to come in on these questions too. And we'll make sure we leave at least like 15 minutes for you all to share your thoughts and feedback and questions. But I wanted to put to Zoha like a slightly provocative question, which is, are local actors best placed to manage all types of climate risk, do you think? So including transboundary climate risk. Is there a risk that we increase the burden on them and let kind of other actors sort of off the hook for adaptation responsibilities that should rightfully be theirs if we do? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's an important question, and I think absolutely it is true that when we do see evidence of locally led approaches being implemented, capacity and knowledge is a key barrier, right? So oftentimes, communities are best placed to know like their own needs and priorities, but they might not necessarily know like the risks that they're facing and how those are changing, and might not be aware of the transboundary implications of a lot of these risks. And so that is definitely a challenge. And I think this is kind of why I think this kind of paired approach makes a lot of sense, in that you maybe need larger scale design of interventions that are done to account for local priorities at the same time. And I think that, participatory approaches to do that would be particularly interesting because, as I was saying, these risks ultimately are felt at the local level, even if they are transboundary. And so I think communities know the impacts they are facing. They might not necessarily know where they're coming from or how, but that is what I see as most important is, okay, they are facing these impacts. How do you make sure that they are protected against these impacts in a way that is equitable, in a way that addresses their priorities and doesn't transfer or exacerbate risks to other communities, as you were saying as well. So, yeah, so I think it's not necessarily one or the other, but some kind of combination of both. The question I had for you was kind of on this this question of equity and how you think approaches to manage transboundary risk could be designed to account for the ways in which certain communities are more disproportionately affected than others by climate impacts, and also how to account for some of these root causes of vulnerability that I mentioned, such as lack of access to resources, unequal power dynamics, and lack of social protection and human rights.
Huge question. You got your own back. I think, well, first of all, I think we need more sophisticated ways of assessing transboundary climate risks. I mean, there are we've given it a shot within SEI sort of several times, but there is no sort of well recognized, very robust, at least well accepted and established way of incorporating transboundary climate risks into climate risk and vulnerability assessments, let alone trying to disaggregate those risks for different and how they manifest differently and for different groups in society. So I think one of the first things we need to do is really, I mean, I would say this because I work for a think tank, but it's to really understand how these risks do differentially affect different marginalized groups. And yeah, sort of build that into our risk assessments and then build that into our adaptation planning. And then I think we need to, I mean, I would totally agree that the local exists within the global, right? Like at the local level, you're constantly affected because like by big global dynamics and forces and so on. So for me, there is what we need to see. It's not this either or either. We need sort of local and global approaches to adaptation going hand in hand. And I think if you look at where you could design adaptation responses or policy responses to transboundary climate risk, they can take place in lots of different contexts. They could take place where the hazard happens. So in another country, you could try and adapt in that other country or support adaptation in that other country to reduce the risk of reduce the chances of this risk ever happening to begin with. So you reduce the effect of that hazard, the impacts of that hazard in that country. You could affect it somewhere along the pathway. So I've talked a lot about trade, for instance, how climate risks will be transmitted through trade and supply chains. You could try and work with the private, with private sector companies or with big international organizations like the WTO to build more resilient international trade. And then you could look to design adaptation options that respond to the risk or preempt that risk at sort of where that risk is realized. And both either sides of the chain will involve, should involve sort of very strong roles for local actors actually also even looking at the pathway approach, because I mean, you look at trade and so on and how you create more resilient supply chains. We need to look at how you create more resilient, conditions for farmers and producers and others that are really inputting into those supply chains. So at all stages, you need the inputs of, and ideas and solutions coming from local communities, in ways, but you also need sort of national and regional, and in some cases international action as well, because you can't sort of build resilience to these risks alone as a community. And that, I think, is also where at a regional or international level you could try and start better accounting for local power dynamics or the sort of power differentials or inequities, or and also through the solutions that are designed start to try and challenge some of those challenging status quo. Maybe before we open it out to the group, I wanted to ask you, Zoha. So, I mean, we talked about those local actors sort of needing the information, especially with transboundary climate risk, that the hazard might be happening on the other side of the world. They might not even be aware of it, might not have a clue how on earth it's going to affect them. Generally speaking, we know adaptation is woefully underfunded. There's a lack of resources. There's often a case of like a lack of legal mandates for even communities to act. But how do we start to change that? I mean, do you think that do you see ways that we could be much better at sharing climate risk and information planning, or sharing national adaptation planning? And it's great that others are coming in. So maybe, Zoha, you go first, and then we'll open it up to the group.
Yeah, I don't know how to answer that question, except to say that, like, I think there needs to be like a full spectrum approach that addresses all of these different levels that comes from national plans and policies as well. So incorporating transboundary approaches into, I think, national adaptation plans, as you said, is and other kind of national approaches to adaptation, and then making sure that that is kind of filtering down at the local level to what measures are implemented, to kind of create that actual framework, or enabling environment for addressing transboundary approaches, transboundary risks, even at the local level. Another kind of aspect that I think is interesting is also that we're not always working in highly democratic contexts, and oftentimes community, particularly, vulnerable and marginalized groups, indigenous peoples, things like that, will not necessarily be like their interests will not necessarily be represented by broader national government plans and policies, right? And so I think that is also interesting and important to account for. And this is often why in loss and damage discussions and locally led adaptation discussions, we think about, to what extent can we work with government actors to enable solutions, or to what extent can we actually bypass the government to make sure that money reaches these people directly? Because nationally led adaptation strategies might not be protecting these groups. On the other hand, it might actually be exacerbating risks for these groups because they are marginalized within that country, right? So I'd be keen to hear if others have reflections on that as well. So
I think I'll jump in here for just one moment to say thank you both so much for this great presentation. This is just fascinating work on adaptation, but also such an interesting exploration of sort of the scales of hazard. And I'm going to turn off our recording now so we can move to a discussion. And I see we already have some hands up, which is wonderful.